Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Since the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016, more than a few people have worried that our democracy is in peril. Is that the case, that our democracy is in a state of decay? Or could it be that our democracy indeed is experiencing something of a renaissance? To help us understand that, and for actually a fascinating conversation on that topic, I've turned to our guest, Law Professor Aziz Huq. He is at the University of Chicago Law School in Chicago, and he's the co-author of a new book called How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. He has looked at this question in terms of democracies all over the world, but our focus is going to be on the United States of America. It's a really important discussion about the health of our country, the health of our constitutional democracy. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned, and please send us your comments and feedback. We really value that very much. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest today is the co-author of a new book called How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, University of Chicago law professor Aziz Huq. Aziz, thank you so much for being on the program.
No, thanks for having me, Aaron.
This is a particularly auspicious day, I think, to be talking about this very intellectual approach to what we are as a country and really where we are as a country in terms of our democracy. On the day we're recording this episode, President Trump, as the shutdown of our government and as the raging debate over border security and immigration generally and the border wall reaches a new height, the president is now talking about declaring a national emergency so that he can take funds that he wants to direct toward the building of a wall that Democrats are refusing to agree that he should be allowed to spend. So we're really in a moment, I think, where it would be very interesting and appropriate for us to question, as you do in your book, what it means to say that we are a democracy in this country. So I want to get into that with you, and perhaps we could start, if you wouldn't mind, give us a little background on yourself and how you came to conceive of and sit down and write this book.
No, thank you very much for having me on, Aaron. I teach constitutional law, criminal procedure, and related classes at the University of Chicago Law School. I've been here for almost 10 years. Prior to this, I was in practice at the Brennan Center for Justice, primarily representing individuals who were detained by the U.S. military at the time, either here or overseas. I clerked for Justice Ginsburg and for a judge on the Second Circuit, Robert Sack, prior to that. And I came to this book like many people who came upon new projects in late 2016 in a moment of panic. So obviously the election result in 2016 was a surprise to me. In particular, I was dismayed by much of the rhetoric about immigrants. I'm originally from the United Kingdom, but my parents were immigrants before me to the United Kingdom. And some of the claims that were being made about the way that political opponents ought to be treated and the way that the media has a role in a democracy. It's often said that when people are experiencing panic, they go to their comfort places, and perhaps because I'm an academic, my comfort place is writing and thinking about things. And a colleague and I, in the weeks after the election, sat down and started to think, well, what's happening here, and what role in particular does law have to play in our moment? Mm-hmm. And we looked around the world and saw there was other examples of this phenomena. And, the book is really an effort to try and understand what role law has by thinking about not just one moment of democratic failure, but thinking about how lots of these moments have played out across the world and over time.
Right. And as you explain in the beginning part of the book, it was perhaps inspired by the election of Donald Trump in 2016, but the book isn't really about Donald Trump per se. And the issues that you're wrestling with and trying to define and understand, both in the American experience and also in the experience of a number of other countries that you write about, is not limited to the events of the last 2 years while Donald Trump has been president. There's a much broader scope here that we have to understand where we are and where we're going as a country.
I think that's right. I think the first thing that's implicit in what you just said is that it's not as if the United States was a perfectly functioning democracy in, let's say, 2014 or 15. There were many ways in which our democracy was deeply flawed. The disproportionate influence of the wealthy on outcomes in Congress, in part, but probably not all, as a consequence of our campaign finance system, is a good example of that. Mm-hmm. The exclusion of many from the franchise through ballot access laws and through various formal and informal kinds of disenfranchisement is yet another really important example. I think what makes the last couple of years different is the sense that I and many others had that the core functioning of electoral choice through elections which operated under the scrutiny of the media and where power that was acquired by elections was exercised basically under the rule of law, not to entrench individuals against a challenge in the next elections, that core premise was under pressure in a way that was unfamiliar, at least in the modern era.
Mm-hmm. But not in an unprecedented way. And so to get us into where I think we need to start, which is really challenging the idea that I think we all as Americans have, that we live in the great democracy, the greatest democracy that ever was. And you set out to really define what that should mean and what it does mean. But this idea that we saw some really ground-shaking developments in this last presidential election. I mean, let me take you to a story that you tell in the book, and just to build suspense, I won't mention the names you do, but you'll recognize it. Imagine a presidential election between a Democrat and a Republican candidate. In the lead up to the campaign, to the final vote, there was racial violence and protests, even some resulting in some deaths. As the ballots were cast, the election boards in several states, notably Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, invalidated a large number of votes, which tipped the election to the Republican candidate. That election ultimately was the subject of a lengthy challenge, and the Republican ultimately succeeded to the presidency, but not without a cloud over the entire presidency. That sounds like something we've lived through in our lifetime, but actually that happened quite a long time ago, right? I mean, you recognize the story?
You're talking about the post-Civil War election that ended between Hayes and Tilden, that ended in a commission being formed to decide who won the election, and a deal being struck in which Hayes ultimately prevailed. But primarily, I think one of the reasons that's a really interesting election is not only is the process that you described, which, as you say, was full of what can euphemistically be called irregularities. It's also an important election because it's the election that ends racial reconstruction in the South. And it's a moment that begins a long, almost century-long period of what one political scientist, using a kind of technical phrase, but I think it's a useful phrase, calls subnational authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. this is the idea that the American South, since the implementation of redemption in the 1890s, has been a single-party state that has maintained authority through the systematic exclusion of African Americans up to the mid to late 1960s. Right, that's a big chunk of American history, and I have no objection to the celebration of American history, like the history that leads up to the Voting Rights Act and the efforts to implement the Voting Rights Act in the teeth of resistance from particularly white officials in the South. Right, there's a lot to be proud of in different moments of history, but the history to be proud of, I think, is the history of striving to achieve and improve a democracy for all. And there's a lot of that in American history, but in order to have that, you need a lot of flaws to be responding to, and we've certainly had no shortage of those.
So, well, right. So how do you, so you reach as you begin this exploration, not only of the American democracy experience and experiment, you arrive at a definition of what you call a liberal constitutional democracy. Tell me about that, and why is that, which sounds a little more complicated than what probably most people are used to thinking about when they think, what do we have in this country? We have a democracy. There's more to that than what most people probably think about. Well, why do you think that's really the appropriate way to think about what the American experience is really all about?
So the label is complicated, but it's really a simple idea. And the simple idea is that in a large country, you need a set of reasonably durable institutions through which people can repeatedly express their political opinions, and we can have thereby turnover in who holds office. So although I think people have it's easy to have a naive view of democracy as merely the capacity to express your opinions, and if you're a majority, to vindicate those opinions. Mm-hmm. I would associate democracy with the idea of repeated expressions of opinions, but also, really importantly, the possibility of removing people from office. Right? If you can't change who is in office, it's not really a democracy. We use a highfalutin label, constitutional liberal democracy, to draw attention to the idea that for those qualities to be satisfied, you need a particular set of institutions. And they're not obscure or alien institutions. It's very simple. The idea is, first, you need a robust and fairly administered set of electoral institutions. Second, you need a set of administrative bodies that ensure that have a sufficiently legalistic quality, right? You, for example, can't have fair elections if the person managing the elections is acting on behalf of one side or another, right? Which, in fact, is what you have in many states, where the Secretary of State's office is a elected official, and in some instances is an elected official who's, as was the case recently in Georgia, for example, actually on the ballot. Right.
Yeah. Or it's just very partisan and politically.
Absolutely, and you've had that in. Absolutely, and Ohio was ahead of the curve on that trend back at the beginning of the 2000s, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to have elections. You need to have a neutral bureaucracy, right? That isn't going to rig the election. That isn't going to bring a criminal prosecution against one of the candidates in the week before the election, right? That the idea of a fairly non-partisanly administered criminal justice system turns out to be so closely packaged in practice with a functioning democracy that once you ignore the need for fair-minded prosecutors who are not going to abuse their authority, you've really kind of lost something integral to the electoral system, right? And this is something that we're now coming into focus. It's now coming into focus in the United States with the threats that have been made with respect to former candidate Clinton. But it's something that many other countries have experienced, where you have some popular candidate who is mysteriously indicted and arrested in the weeks before the election, right?
Right.
So you need elections, you need fair bureaucrats, or worse, absolutely. You need fair bureaucrats. And the third thing you need is rights to speech and assembly, right? So all we're trying to capture with the idea of a constitutional liberal democracy, right? Constitutional in the sense that we have a neutrally administered state, liberal in the sense that the classically liberal rights to speech and assembly are respected, and democracy in the sense that we have a meaningful electoral framework that allows for majority choice. So the label is just meant to capture what, as an institutional matter, right? What, in terms of bodies on the ground, you really, at a bare minimum, need for a functioning democracy.
Well, and again, we're talking about an ideal here, one that, because if you go back to the founding of our country, which is celebrated by all of us, by politicians of all stripes, and every American learning the most basic civics. In elementary school, we learned to celebrate the founders of this country. But of course, if we applied these standards of free speech and assembly, free and fair elections, and a bureaucracy that's neutral, those three pillars as you define them, in the 1790s, our country would get an F on its report card. And then we have years of slavery, and then we fight a civil war, and for maybe a brief moment, when slavery is ended, and blacks get the right to vote in this country, we have a few members elected to Congress in Washington. But then, as we mentioned a moment ago, you have this election in 1876. Rutherford B. Hayes is elected, and as you point out, we see the end of Reconstruction and a long era, many decades, up to the 1950s and 60s, when once again blacks are largely disenfranchised. So you could take a very dark view of our country's history and say, in many important ways, and in these fundamental ways that you say are essential to a constitutional liberal democracy, and say our country's really never had such a system that where we can say we would have gotten an A on a report card in each of these three areas.
Well, I certainly don't think that at any time before 1919, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, opening the franchise to women, that our definition was satisfied, because any polity in which half the polity, by definition, cannot vote because of their gender, just doesn't count, right? And I would say that democracy was deeply imperfect, at least until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was enacted, and the high point of democracy has probably been in the 70s through the early 2000s.
So post Watergate up until
That's right.
But that's not a very long stretch of time, though.
It's not a very long stretch of time, and you or I can very quickly identify, as we were doing earlier, a bunch of very serious flaws in, even by my kind of minimalist definition, in how democracy works in that period. So if there's something to be celebrated, it's the movement forward rather than any particular moment of time where there was perfection achieved.
Well, and that's why I think we have to go through some of this back history too, because it is a march toward a more perfect union. It is a march toward the ideals. They were wonderful ideals that the founders set up for us, even if they haven't been practiced, to their fullest potential perhaps ever, but certainly for long stretches of our country's history. But if we want to understand where we are on that march toward the more perfect union, towards a more honest and full, adherence to those values in the current times we live in, we have to understand what some of these principles and ideals are. So, coming into the election, to take us back to that moment, which leads you to sit down and map this out and write this book. What was it about the election that let's apply it to those three pillars that you defined for us: free and fair elections, really valuing and respecting the right to free speech and assembly, and a neutral bureaucracy to commit itself to the rule of law when it comes to administering these things. Where do you see it in 2016?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I and many people worried about was the third of those criteria, which is the persistence of a neutral bureaucracy committed to the rule of law that would not interfere or distort the electoral process. And I and many others worried about threats to free speech and free association rights that might emerge if you had a much more politicized bureaucracy and administration, right? Yeah. And I think that I think there's been an informal and a formal vector along which the concerns or the threats that I've described have proceeded. On the one, I'm sorry for the cough.
That's okay. I know you have a cold. It's all right.
We can think of the development since the 2016 election as having a formal and an informal part. On the formal side, what we've seen is an effort to deconstruct norms and to some extent actual rules that constrained the politicization of, in particular, the Justice Department and the Attorney General, under the shadow primarily of the investigation into Russian interference in the election, but also more generally, right? And that's come in part from the White House, but it also came from House Republicans who took some quite unusually aggressive postures toward the FBI in 2017, in particular, and 18, when they perceived the agency as being potentially adverse to their political coalition. And I think that on that front, although obviously we have yet to see what happens to the Mueller investigation after a new attorney general is appointed and after Rod Rosenstein leaves,
right, which he just said this week he's leaving.
Yeah, the formal institutions have taken a battering, but I'm not sure that I certainly think that they've experienced damage, but I don't think that the damage has yet been irreparable. Right? There's nothing that suggests that with new regulations, for example, governing when and how the White House can speak to ongoing criminal investigations, with new regulations or perhaps a new law, although I'm not sure that the current Mueller Protection Acts do this, shoring up the special counsel's office and providing it with a firmer institutional basis. I think there's much that can be mitigated of the damage that's occurred. What I think is harder to tell is how far we've gone along the second vector, which is the not the formal legal attacks on institutions, but the informal changes and alterations to our expectations and political norms with respect to free speech and, in particular, truthfulness. Right, and I just think this is really hard to tell. Two things. The first thing is that it's now become there is now no longer a political cost experienced by the president for outright lying. And in part, that's a function of just the frequency of the lies, and in part, it's a function of his immunity, so to speak, to embarrassment with respect to misstating the truth. And that's a deeply concerning development, right? Particularly, for example, today, when there is the prospect of him invoking authority under one of two federal statutes that allow for emergency authority with respect to certain kinds of construction projects, right? The idea is that he's going to the invocation of a national emergency under factually dubious circumstances to achieve a political goal that end-runs Congress, right? So the lack of constraint upon untruths by this particular president is having a quite material consequence today.
Well, so we're going to talk about some of the ways in which your concern is that our liberal constitutional democracy is being eroded. Perhaps instead of a steady march forward, we're seeing some steps, some important steps back. And I want to look at some of the specific ways you feel that may be the case. But I think we have to pause here because there, I think, clearly are some ways in which this president defies any comparison to prior presidents, and some ways in which maybe he doesn't. You know, I think a lot of people voted for Donald Trump, and I'm not putting myself into this mix one way or the other, but just as an observer, really precisely because they saw him as a disruptor. You know, that I'm not sure they knew he was really particularly Democratic or particularly Republican, and he's been both. He's pretty much had every view there can be, for instance, on abortion, or take your pick. But I think that was part of the appeal. He would say things that others perhaps weren't comfortable saying, or would never say, even if they were not true, and everybody might know they weren't true. And he would, you know, he famously said he could shoot a man in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and people would still elect him. I mean, just the outrageousness factor seemed to be part of the appeal. And, you know, that seems very different in trying to put him into any kind of context. But on the other hand, we do focus a lot on the things that he says and whether they're true or not. And a lot of them are pretty readily proved to be not true. But is he really the first president who's lied to the American people, even lied quite a lot? I mean, we have a different technology. We have a different media today. We have cell phones that can instantly take a video of somebody. We have archives of videos that can be searched through to see whether somebody said something different on a different day. I mean, did JFK lie? Did Eisenhower ever lie? I mean, is that part really so different? And I guess taking all that together, where does that fit into understanding how that may impact these institutions, which are so important and we're obviously very important before Donald Trump, and they're going to be very important a long time after Donald Trump. How do these things play into the mix in understanding where we are in this construct of our system, as you've put it, this liberal constitutional democracy? And I know that was very long-winded. I'm sorry.
No. Let me unpack first the disruptor point and then say something about the lies.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right that many people experience a sense of exclusion and unrepresentativeness with respect to the political system. I think part of that sense is driven by economic change that has left some communities by, and part of it is driven by cultural change that is, in many ways, in my view, a good thing. So the fact that women and people of color have more of a role and are taking on positions that they otherwise once were excluded from, I understand how that discomforts people people, but I'm not willing to recognize any kind of moral force behind that discomfort. So I think that there's a number of reasons why people had discomfort and a feeling of alienation. Notice that not all of them had to do with government, right? Government certainly had something to do with it, but I think that in many ways people are responding to broader economic and cultural changes. And the notion that there are ways that government could be more responsive and that government could be more open and reflective of people's preferences is not one that I disagree with, and not one that I'd want to push back on. The difference, however, in the point that I think is important to emphasize is that it's one thing to disrupt institutions in ways that make them more open and more democratic and more conducive to the flourishing of a polity in which all have the opportunity to express their views. And it's another thing to obtain disruption or to push for disruption that closes down democracy by imposing costs on people who have particular political views, by limiting or trying to squelch the free flow of information in a polity, or by attacking individuals because of their ethnicity or their perceived national origin. And there's a lot. One way to see that difference is in thinking about the term populism, which is bandied about a lot these days. Right. And populism is often characterized as a negative. I think in part because it often has all of those negative qualities that I just listed. I think what you're pushing on isn't there really the possibility of a good populism, a populism that is not exclusionary, is not reactionary, is not racist, a word that I think is not inappropriate here. Absolutely, there is the possibility of that populism, and indeed the American populist movement of the 1890s, under the leadership of a man called Tom Watson, started out looking that way. Right, the Populist Party started out in the American South making alliances with African Americans, drawing them into the political process, and it was only over time and slowly, that Watson and others abandoned that strategy and committed to Jim Crow, right, and to making the case for the exclusion of African Americans and the elevation of working class whites as packaged together as a single deal. And I don't want to deny the possibility of the early Tom Watson, right, the good populism, but I don't think that that's what we have now, right? I don't think that you can characterize the clusters of policies now being evoked or pushed under the rubric of populism here or actually in other countries, right? And it's just, it's certainly true in the United Kingdom with Brexit. I don't think you can characterize them as being an effective form of democracy improving populism.
Right, but on the disruption point, again, we're talking about, in a way, what is the health of our constitutional democracy? What is the health of our civil society, citizens relating to their government relating to the citizens? And if we're going to look at what impact a president like this president has on that, and where that may, what that may say about where we're going, I think we have to think about what's the real impact of this one person in this one moment in time. And just to give as an example of what I'm thinking, again, I think a lot of people cheered, and a lot of people have cheered and do cheer when he says things that are really out of the ordinary, for, not the kinds of things you hear from, the usual politician when he pushes back. Even when he pounds on the table, as he did yesterday, it was reported, and walked out of a meeting with the Democratic leaders on this ongoing immigration debate. I think there's a lot of people that probably cheer that. But we're talking about what's the impact on our constitutional democracy. And, one of the things that I've taken note of and am very concerned about are the things that he said about the media, calling the media the enemy of the people, and
Absolutely,
constant,
yeah.
This refrain of fake news. But couldn't you also say that we're living right now in a period that you could characterize as one of a resurgence of investigative reporting? The New York Times, I think, is doing better than ever. I mean, I know the president always talks about the failing New York Times, but I think the facts are that the New York Times and the Washington Post and other journalistic institutions are doing better than ever. And what has he really done to erode one of those three pillars that you define, which is free speech? That has to include a free press. Maybe it's had actually the opposite effect.
I think it's very right. I think that's very possible. So there's two ways in which the present political moment might play out, and I think that our book is actually a part of the dynamic that I'm just going to describe. So one way is that the effort to erode norms of legality in the Justice Department succeeds. The attacks on the press succeed. And you have a situation in which, as in some other countries like Hungary, neutral-minded reporters or forums that stick to more or less accepted principles of journalistic integrity have been squeezed out of existence. And you have a situation in which people are fearful to run for political office, opposing a party or a leader, because they're worried about either the attacks on them by that leader and his administration, or by allied third parties, right? So bloggers and people on Reddit who go after candidates and journalists, which we have seen, right? All of that stuff gets much worse, and we have a situation in which we have all the bells and whistles of elections, but in which, in fact, there's very little competition and there's very little information about how power is being used by those who've got it and who are not really at any risk of losing it. Right. That, I think, is the dark story. Yeah. The happy story is one in which you have a figure who promises to do many of these things, starts to do a bunch of them, but thereby initiates a wave of objections and opposition, both within institutions and outside in civil society and in academia, where you have people writing books about what is it that a democracy needs in order to keep going, like our book. Our book is about law and institutions. Other people have written books about, how do you change the economy? How do you make opportunity more inclusive? And I don't want to say that our approach, which is really law and institution focused, is any more important than those books, right? But you have this wave of thinking and action and political mobilization, or not just in favor of the Democratic Party, but in favor of, we really think that an inclusive democracy that is not that does not exclude or that does not demean individuals or groups on the basis of their race or gender or the like, in which power is held to account, and in which the idea of mutual respect and decency is held up as an ideal by all. Right. It may be that the 2016 election, 20 years from now, will be seen as a catalyst for better government. Right. Yeah. We're not there by any stretch, but there's certainly both the good and the bad possibility. And I think I don't speak just for myself, but for the many other people who have written or advocated or talked, thought through, like you are, these issues, I think all of us are hoping that our efforts put us on the good rather than the bad track.
Well, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat or look to with too sunny a position on the times we're living in either. But
Yeah.
I mean, taking each of these three areas that you focus on, for instance, and again, there was just this report, I believe yesterday, that a journalist in Turkey, Pelin Unker, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but a female journalist in Turkey has been imprisoned because she wrote some articles that were critical of the Turkish president. The president felt that she was guilty of defamation of the president and his family, and they threw her in jail.
Yep.
Now, we've had a president who has talked about toughening the libel laws because of articles he didn't like, which may sound like this, what happened in Turkey, but Trump isn't putting any journalists in jail. And I'm not saying he has a perfect relationship with the news media either, but he says a lot of outrageous things, but again, maybe one impact is the media is flourishing in response. I don't know what is happening in the broader culture and in the broader society and people's attitudes to the media, whether confidence erodes because of some of this combativeness that they see coming from the president. But the institution, which is really the important thing, as I'm gathering from your writings, the strength of the institution is the important thing. I'm not sure the same can be said about elections, and you cover that a lot. And I think that's why the Rutherford B. Hayes story probably, I'd venture to bet most Americans didn't even know we had a president called Rutherford B. Hayes, but we did in 1876. And that story, is so, to me, instructive because we have a long history and we still have this as part of our present, that elections are not free, that that so many people are still disenfranchised in one way or another, and that elected officials running federal elections at the state level can still influence the outcomes of those elections, and maybe see a president elected as a result of those maneuvers. That seems to me to be such a great concern for us going forward. And how confident do you feel that maybe out of this era, again, this was a president who, before he was elected, was talking about rigged elections and it was all rigged and it's all, that's something you hear out of the mouths of authoritarians in other contexts, and you write about this. But again, there are the words that are said, and then there's the reality. Could we see, as we have seen, sort of a flourishing in the journalist world and in the institution of the media? Do you think we could see, because of the experience we're living through now, a focus on improving access to the polls and a renewed coming together to try to address these issues in some positive ways, or are you more pessimistic and see the institution of free elections in our country being eroded in a way that's potentially very threatening to what we have?
Well, I think that there are signs that point in both directions. Mm-hmm. I think that the referenda on voting rights and on redistricting commissions that are independent of politics that prevailed in a number of states in November 2018 are really, really positive signs, right? I think those are big steps in the right direction, and they show that there's often a bipartisan hunger for the kind of more opening, inclusive transformations of democracy that I've associated with quote-unquote good populism. I think that the reason for skepticism is I would focus upon the shifting role of the federal courts and the possibility that an increasingly conservative Supreme Court will stand in the way of, for example, campaign finance reform. For example, it might reverse its decision upholding the constitutionality of independent redistricting commissions at the state level. It might issue rulings that invalidate race-conscious remedies in the voting rights context, such as
it already has, right? The Supreme Court has already done that.
Right, and even this last year, it issued an opinion on overt discrimination in the electoral process that had such a narrow definition of discrimination that it's very easy to work for if you're aiming to disenfranchise a racial minority. It's now much easier just to work around what the court has said. So I see the potential for, on the one hand, the public to become increasingly accepting and increasingly committed to a broad and deep version of what we call liberal constitutional democracy. You might call it inclusive democracy, and where you have an entrenched federal court system that, in many instances, is pushing back on it at the behest of of interest groups that are not benefiting from these trends. And we've seen conflicts of this kind in the past, right? To go back to history again, this is not dissimilar from the conflict that emerged in the 1920s and 1930s between the New Deal political coalition and the Supreme Court. It's interesting that the Supreme Court in the last couple of years has decided a couple of cases about Congress's authority to constrain jurisdiction in ways that look outcome determinative. In fact, in those cases, it's upheld, albeit with fragmented opinions, the legality of those constraints. And I would not be surprised if we start to see a great deal more conflict between the regressive elements of, or those elements of our society that are regressively oriented toward our democracy, through the courts in particular, and through those elements of our society that are trying to open up our democracy. And that may well be a motif for the next, say, 10 or 20 years of our national life.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the federal courts and ultimately the Supreme Court is where a lot of these fights are going to be fought. I just saw the other day there was a case, I believe, out of Texas, if I'm not mistaken, some kind of a advocacy group, a religiously oriented advocacy group, was trying to ban a public library from having a what was basically an LGBT-focused reading hour at the library. And they were trying to argue that this was, violating the religious rights and religious freedom, and that case was thrown out by the federal judge there. I mean, there are so many fights like that we're going to see that are going to test, I think, some of the basic rights we have to vote, to associate, to express.
And I just add to that I think we're going to start to see more and more fights and debates. We already are about the legitimacy of the courts as arbiters of these questions. I think that 100 years ago, if you were a political progressive, the idea that you rely upon the courts for the protection of your basic freedoms would have seemed openly absurd. It just would have been seen as crazy, right? Nobody would think that, right? And
well, unless you were a corporation.
Absolutely, right. I said political progressive,
right.
And I think that really changed as a consequence of Brown v. Board, and the set of jurisprudential changes that Brown set in motion, pretty much ran their course by the mid-70s, right? So that we're 45 years after the Brown Revolution has sputtered to a halt, and it's still the case that the public views the Supreme Court as a liberal institution, notwithstanding the fact that the last time the court had a majority of Democratic Democratic president-selected justices was in 1969. Right, since 1969, a majority of the justices have been appointed by Republican presidents. I think that the kind of conflicts that we're going to see are going to really sharpen awareness and raise questions about what once upon a time we lawyers called the counter-majoritarian difficulty.
Mm. Well, and there've been some glimmers, some moments since the 70s. I mean, we had not just a few years ago the Obergefell decision on same-sex marriage, beautiful opinion by now retired Justice Kennedy, but with this court and the makeup of this court, it's I think you're right. It's a big question mark whether we'll see any more opinions that not only seem to make the kind of progress that decision assured us, but was written in a way, such an expansive way, in talking about dignity and fundamental rights and liberties. Just the language used in that opinion, I just wonder whether we're going to see another opinion like that for quite some time.
I think it's very unlikely. I think that as you say, we're more likely to see opinions constraining the interests of racial minorities, LGBTQ individuals, and members of minority religious groups, and we're more likely to see decisions recognizing the interests of majority religious groups. We're more likely to see opinions tamping down on individuals' ability to challenge discrimination, and we'll see opinions increasing the level of centralization of power in government. Right, I think that's going to be a theme in the near term.
And particularly, I would assume, particularly concentration of power in the executive branch. I mean, that would be really what to look for, and that's why I started in the introduction with the news of our day, as we won't post this for a bit, but the news of the day today is the president saying he's almost certainly, it went from a possibility to today an almost certainty that he's going to invoke this statute that would allow him to declare a national emergency over this immigration issue. A lot of people saying that it is a fabricated crisis. Others saying it's been a crisis a long time in the making, but still one that has to be dealt with. But either way, I think really an unprecedented use of the executive power in a situation like this. I mean, there was no tornado or massive forest fire or hurricane that we're talking about here, which is where you usually see this power invoked.
Right, and there are two federal statutes that arguably might be employed for a construction project, and without getting into the weeds of either one, I think that there are genuine questions as to whether the kind of power that's being authorized by those statutes encompasses the building of a wall, right? At least along the southern border. They're really not statutes that are designed for this purpose, and I think there's going to be legal challenges that raise that question, legal challenges that raise concerns about the military's involvement in immigration enforcement, which is prohibited by another statute, and questions about whether there's a violation of the appropriations power, right? Congress is supposed to, this is a fight about appropriations, and it's not clear to me from reading the statutes that what they allow is repurposing monies as opposed to people across different functions in ways that circumvents the House's authority under Article 1, Section 7 to decide what gets appropriated. And there's also, by the way, I think, going to be a whole set of questions about eminent domain. At least the reporting on these issues has suggested that the populations of places where a wall might be built, and some of that wall is going to have to be on private land, by the way, aren't very happy about this. Neither Republican nor Democratic representatives or senators, with the exception of Ted Cruz and maybe Martha McSally, although her position is a bit unclear, nobody's embracing this idea. Nobody who actually lives in these districts or represents these districts is embracing this idea, and I would expect to see a lot of resistance with respect to the seizure of land for the purposes of having this construction happen.
Well, and to put it back into the constitutional democracy framework, it sounds like what you're describing in this particular example, the president invoking his power to declare a national emergency, that this is one of those things that's going to end up in the courts and probably is going to, if he decides to go through this, and I imagine this is what they're evaluating right now, is if they really are prepared to take on the judiciary on this. But eventually, it would seem this is going to end up in front of the Supreme Court. Which is going to have to test, right, the ultimate power of the president for something like this.
It depends upon how seriously you think the demand for a wall should be taken. If you think that this is I think there's at least kind of three stories that might be told here. The first is, I'm sure many of your listeners have heard that the idea of a wall arose in the context of the 2016 campaign because Roger Stone and others were trying to get something that would keep the candidate on message, and they came up with the idea of just writing the word wall on a piece of paper and holding it up and being like, hey, remember, talk about a wall. So it wasn't actually a policy idea. It was just a way of maintaining Trump's focus, right? So if you think that's right, then this is just an eat a fix that he thinks that it's an effort to play to the base. Once he's shown that he's done his best, he'll just move on to whatever the next thing is, right? So this will come and go, right? That's one possibility. The second possibility is that this was an effort to break the will of the congressional Democrats before they came into office, right? It was an effort to establish that, look, if you try and do anything that is contrary to my purposes, I will shut down the government, and this will hurt you more than me because I will be more successful in the battle for public opinion in blaming you than having the blame assigned to me, right? And at least as far as the present polling suggests, that if that was the strategy, it's not working, right? And if that's the case, then the use of the emergency power it's a Hail Mary that gets him out of a relatively unpopular, ultimately ineffectual political ploy. And once you're out of this of the politically unpleasant situation that we're in now, speaking from the perspective of the White House, who cares? There's a wall, there's not a wall. I mean, it's not going to do anything, right? And then the third possibility is the one that you alluded to. He really thinks that the wall matters. In which case, yes, then we will have a long, protracted litigation fight over the wall. If I can be provocative for a second, I have heard people say that, look, why are the Democrats fighting a wall? Sure, it adds to the budget, it has environmental effects, but at the end of the day, I mean, isn't it a Keynesian stimulus, right? It's just pumping money into the economy, right? Which is kind of a democratic. It's not a policy position that the Democrats are antithetical to, and it's really not going to change, right? Immigration rates, either formal or informal. It's just not going to have that much effect on movement across the southern border. And so, give them this wall. I mean, who cares, right?
Well, I'll tell you what I think it comes down to. I think there's one very good reason why the Democrats have dug in their heels. They're not going to agree to wall because he wants it. It is exactly
absolutely.
They're not going to have the first act of this new era of a Democratic-controlled House of Representatives be that they give Donald Trump his singular campaign promise.
No. And everyone plays to their base. I completely understand. Right. And invoking the idea of Keynesian stimulus is something that the lawyers and the economists can do, but I completely accept that nobody else gives that idea the time of day.
But it will be interesting because if he has his heels dug in as he seems to, again, it is going to go to the courts, and the way it's shaping up and the way you're describing it, it seems like it's not even really going to be so much about the wall anymore. It's going to be about executive power. It's really going to be about, does he have the authority even to do this here? And I think that's something to keep a very close eye on. And to think about the things we've been talking about the last hour, because if we see more meat on the bone when Donald Trump appears through the words and statements and manner, just the way in which he functions, to seek to strengthen the power of the executive, to do what he wants, regardless of what Congress wants, what his advisors advise, what the rule of law might suggest, just to do what he says he wants to do. If he seems more and more able to do that, then I think maybe we are looking at a set of circumstances where those pillars that you identify as key to a successful and healthy liberal constitutional democracy start to
No, I think that's right. And I think the
danger.
two fronts, right, and I think the two fronts that you're going to see that on are first challenges to the House's power to obtain information in the form of executive privilege claims.
Yes.
And I actually don't think that the wall issue is going to be all that important. I think that what's more important is the question whether, for example, offices like the special counsel's office and the like can be insulated from a measure of presidential control. Right. This is the unitary executive theory that has percolated in many years. Right. So, for example, I've seen academic work challenging the idea that the chairman of the Federal Reserve can be insulated from presidential control. Right. A world in which it becomes plausible to throw the Fed chair under the unitary presidency bus. It's a changing world.
Yeah. Well, and what happens with the Mueller investigation, and when we talked about this on this program. Can the president be indicted?
Yeah.
Can he be forced to give testimony? What happens when the Mueller report is finished? What will Congress do? Those are things that also in the next 2 years could end up as real tests of executive power in relation to the rule of law. So we'll have to keep
I think that's right.
all of that.
I totally think that's
well. Aziz Huq, Professor, we could talk about. I know I certainly could talk about this all day. This is so fun and so fascinating.
Yeah, it's been great.
Aziz is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Chicago and the co-author of the new book, now out by the University of Chicago Press, called "How to Save a Constitutional Democracy." There's a lot of great stuff in the book. I enjoyed reading it, and we'll put a link in the description for this episode, and so people can just click on the link.
That's terrific. Thanks so much, Aaron. I really appreciate being on.